Your vote is precious.
Almost sacred.
It is unbelievable
that there are Republican officials
trying to stop some people from voting, cutting polling hours and imposing requirements intended to suppress the vote.
I've seen this before.
Too many people died to make it possible for every American to exercise their right to vote. We have come too far together to ever turn back.
That's a new spot from a voting rights group that is pushing for the Senate to take up the bill that the House passed, which would make it easier for people to vote, as it already attempts to rein in states that are doing just the opposite. In a minute, we're going to be talking about how red states are still trying to, well, maybe no uncertain terms, mess with the last election here. But we're going to start first with what those same states are doing to impact the next one. We're now seeing a wave of voter restriction laws continuing to wash over red state after red state. I want to begin in Florida, where Governor Ron DeSantis, he just signed a law making it harder to get mail ballots. It also toughens voter ID rules for absentee ballots, makes it harder to register. It also gives partisan observers more power in the process. And the governor, he didn't even hide how partisan this all was. He did the actual signing on camera, but for Fox and Fox News alone, pro-Trump group called Club 45 USA, they were the folks standing right behind the governor. Trump, he won Florida just like he won Texas, but apparently not stopping those states from making widespread changes to the way the people cast their vote. Republicans in the Texas legislature, they passed a sweeping bill loaded with voting restrictions. The state Senate now working its own version. GOP, it markets itself as the pro-business party, but more than 50 large corporations that operate in Texas, they're publicly opposing the new measures that include Microsoft, American Airlines, Patagonia, Levi, Etsy, Warby Parker, and many others. A group of more than 100 Houston area executives authoring another letter bashing this GOP election bill as well as bad for America. Now, the moves in both Florida and Texas coming after a similar law passed in Georgia, which caused big backlash from companies there. And then we have Arizona. That's where Republicans are focusing on the next election, but also still not letting go about what just happened in November. They're trying to prove, even though there's no evidence to support it, that Trump, he won the last one. And again, I'll break the suspense, that Donald didn't. He lost in Arizona and nationwide, and if you look at the popular vote, not even close. The partisan recount that was ordered by the state Senate is still ongoing in Maricopa County, Arizona, and rather than being run by election officials who did their own recount last year, this one is being conducted, and again, I'm not trying to be flip here with the name. They call themselves the Cyber Ninjas. The CEO of the group supports the big lie that the election was stolen from Trump. Plus, they went to court to try to keep what it's doing secret from any observation, in part because they have zero experience when it comes to running recounts. And now the ninjas, they're trying to get contracts to do similar recounts in other states. Again, yes, red ones. So the questions about the 2020 election will never end. Now, the Cyber Ninjas, they may be good at the ninja part, as they're trying to do everything, as I said, under the radar. And that could be very dangerous. They are looking at people's actual ballots, spurring fears that they could tamper with those ballots. Plus, they're doing off-the-wall things like using ultraviolet light to check for bamboo in ballots. It's part of some wild conspiracy theory that bad ballots were flown in from Asia. I can't make this up. And among those that are counting for the ninjas is a guy who was photographed, yes, participating in the Capitol Hill riot. Even longtime Arizona Republicans say what's going on in Maricopa is just nuts, including a one-time state attorney general.
He's one of the ones counting ballots. He had a pen in hand. So this is an unbiased count to make sure everything was fair. And you have one of the insurrectionists who is looking at his own name on a ballot. The whole thing is a sham. These people just can't get over it. They lost. In every election somebody loses, and most people can take it and some people can't. So I agree with you, this is totally over the line. It's totally out of control.
Now I've got the Department of Justice issuing a warning letter to the people running that recount, saying it could be violating the civil rights of Arizonians, that there are issues of non-compliance with federal election laws, ballots could be altered, lost, or compromised. And since the Cyber Ninjas plan to actually interview voters, there are obvious fears of voter intimidation. I want to bring in our next guest who says it's not just about compromising rights when it comes to being able to cast your ballot, but also the folks that are doing the work to make sure that we can all vote. He recently penned an opinion piece in the Washington Post with the headline, "Republicans aren't just making it harder to vote, they're going after election officials too." Joshua Douglas, a law professor at the University of Kentucky, kind enough to give us a few minutes. And Joshua, maybe I'm as guilty as anybody because I look at the cyber ninjas and I just laugh at the insanity of it all, thinking nobody's going to believe this nonsense, let alone put credibility in it. But not only do people believe this, or at least people parroting on Capitol Hill, they're even part of the big lie crowd, but they're threatening people who are just doing their jobs regardless of their party affiliation. And you wrote in your piece about people in Iowa, in Florida, and Texas making it harder on election officials, not just in those states, but in other states, for the temerity of saying, we've done the count, we've done the recount, we've done the audit, it's legit. They're getting death threats consequentially.
Yeah, it's really horrible to see what's happening to the heroes on the ground. Local election officials are highly trained. They're professional. If you talk to any of them, they'll say basically they don't care who wins. What they want is a high turnout and a landslide election where the margins are not close. They want to run a fair, high turnout and fraud-free election, and yet they're being attacked all over the place. So, they were under attack after November 2020 and leading into January with death threats and the like. And now you have states passing laws that would actually criminalize these election workers if they don't strictly follow the new voter restrictions that these states are passing.
Josh, you're a law professor, so help me out with this. What inherent rights do we have as Americans, regardless of the state we live in, that we have a right to a free and a fair election to cast our ballot? Where can states step in to infringe on that basic right? And where can't they? Are we headed for a collision at the federal level if, let's say, a Florida decides, well, no, you're only going to be able to open up these ballots for these certain amount of hours, basically because we don't like the way you voted in the last election?
Well, it probably won't surprise you, Richard, that that's a pretty complicated and complex question involving multiple layers of constitutional law and Supreme Court guidance. Ultimately, the Supreme Court has said that there's a right to vote inherent within the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Essentially, states have to treat voters equally in their access to the ballot. But also importantly, state constitutions grant the right to vote. In almost every state, the state constitution has language that says something like, every citizen of this state shall be a qualified voter. The question then becomes, will the courts uphold the right to vote and brush back these state attempts at voter restrictions that do treat voters rather unequally? And I'd say it's a mixed bag right now, in part because not only are unscrupulous politicians attacking voting rights, but they're also putting their own cronies essentially on the courts to ensure that the legislatures have the deference to do as they wish to the right to vote.
But here's the part where I struggle with, Professor, and believe me, I'm not a babe in the woods when it comes to politics and the agendas behind it, but this seems to be a remedy in search of a problem, in that you have Republican elected officials, whether it be at the Secretary of State levels or at the Board of Elections, who have said, guys, we've gone through this 2 and 3 times. We've had minders from both political parties who observed at every ballot that was being counted, the math is the math. And if there's any fraud that we found, obviously not enough to overturn an election, but it's even come from the side that's accusing the other of malfeasance. Won't a court inevitably look and say, wait a minute, you're trying to create a disenfranchisement policy, even though that you can show no evidence of wrongdoing? And why wouldn't that, be the prima facie rationale to say, no good, go back to the old way?
Well, I think there's 2 answers to that question. And the first is the courts have already done that, at least with respect to the 2020 election results. Trump in his campaign filed lawsuits all over the country that were completely frivolous, had no evidence whatsoever, and the courts routinely and soundly threw them out. And so the 2020 election has been affirmed in terms of the results, not only by the election officials, but by the courts. But in terms of new laws in response to the big lie, that's a much harder question, because the Constitution does give state legislatures in the first instance the ability to regulate elections. So they have a textual hook to say, we're the ones that should determine how our elections should be run. Now, of course, anybody thinking about this in terms of an aspect of fairness would say it's crazy. I'm a big baseball fan, and I'd say, if you have a big game between the Yankees and the Red Sox, the Yankees get to choose the umpires and also get to choose the rules, no one would say that's fair. But that's essentially what we have with our elections, and that's because partisan state legislatures are given the authority to regulate elections. So then again, that brings about the courts. To what extent will the courts scrutinize legislatures more carefully to say, look, if you're going to impose a burden on the right to vote, if you're going to treat voters unequally, you have to have a really good reason for doing so. But unfortunately, the U.S. Supreme Court and federal appeals courts in 2020 really took a light touch to review of state laws, even during a pandemic when voters had a much harder time casting a ballot. So the signals from the U.S. Supreme Court are not promising with respect to scrutinizing carefully these new laws. Instead, deference is being given to these politicians who are, of course, self-interested in crafting the rules of the game.
And you've got a book, in fact, about, it's called Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. And I want to get to some of the solutions you think we ought to inherit. But one of the things that surprised folks was there was efforts even made prior to the 2020 elections, and they backfired in a lot of ways. When you take a right away from anyone, particularly Americans, all of a sudden, even if they weren't planning to exercise that right, they're going to fight for it a little bit more. Is there a feeling that, since this has nothing to do with integrity and transparency, that Republicans might regret it? Because historically, they were the party that was trying to increase mail-in voting, targeting a lot of seniors. And then only when it became where you had brown and black voters voting in larger numbers, certainly in Florida, that all of a sudden it became, crisis number one here to restrict that as a way to cast your ballot. Is there a fear that there may be a look back not too long ago from Republicans saying, this didn't turn out the way we hoped?
Well, I think there's been some murmurings of that concern that there's going to be a voter backlash and more people will turn out, in fact. But, even thinking about the 2020 election, which had a record turnout of about 2/3 of eligible Americans showing up, that means that 1/3 of the eligible electorate did not vote, chose to sit this one out. And so you have to sort of question, to what extent do we have a strong democracy when 1/3 of the people don't show up? And can you make inroads on the margins, right? So I think the theory is, if we can restrict the right to vote, or at least just make it harder for our opponents' supporters to show up, then perhaps we can win a little bit on the margins in a close election, right? They're not going to be able to make a difference in a landslide election, but you could certainly make a difference in a close election. But the other thing I think that is sort of overlaying all of this is the problem of gerrymandering, right? Where we don't start with a system that's fair with respect to the most votes should lead to the most people in the legislature, the most people representing us. And we're about to start in on a new round of redistricting as well. And these things are all intertwined, right? Because if you can draw the lines in such a way that skews the results, and you can impose voter restrictions that make it harder for some people to turn out, then you can make a difference on the margins, even if you might have voter backlash and higher turnout among some populations.
Again, the book, Vote for U.S. or Vote for Us, How to Take Back Our Elections and Change the Future of Voting. Professor Douglas, I appreciate the time.
Thanks for having me.